wrong.
Uh-oh. I dread to think.
It started out being about whether it was right or wrong to whip your children, and it quickly got into quite dark avenues. The letter starts here, and it's somebody called a rejoicer in the restoration of the rod. So it kind of starts off saying there's a great need for there to be kind of more discipline, and it essentially moves on to a very, very detailed description of a school in Kentish Town. She then laid the cane aside, and when he had taken off his trousers and had tucked his shirt at her bidding under his waistcoat and laid himself across the little bed with his person bare, she told him she should birch him now for refusing to obey her orders. So...
Oh!
It kind of goes...
It goes into that detail,
yeah,
doesn't it, that kind of shows that he is getting off on this.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the most disturbing ones, I think, but some of them talk about things like tying a 17-year-old girl's hands to a peg on the wall so that you could beat her, and it starts getting very kind of sexualised and weird.
It's making me feel a bit sick, actually.
Yeah, it's really not nice.
So what's going on here? And this is a polite magazine for English women, English ladies, and it seems to be taken over by men who, well, it's getting a bit pornographic, I think.
It's obvious that some of the people found it quite uncomfortable, because you get some letters people have written in saying, I used to lend this magazine to my friends, but now I don't really feel comfortable doing so because of some of the content. In fact, people got kind of so upset about the fact that these letters were appearing that Samuel Beaton decided that he was going to separate them out from the main magazine, and he published them in a supplement instead, which you could buy separately. On the title page it says, "Letters addressed to the editor of the English Women's Domestic Magazine on the whipping of girls."
Oh my goodness. Is this still pretending it's asking for rules to how to discipline your children and servants?
There are genuine concerns amongst the blatant pornography to us.
I'm actually quite annoyed, really, that men seem to have hijacked this women's magazine, and I think they're using the unwitting woman as part of their audience. They're getting off on the idea of women reading this and not knowing what's going on. It's a form of abuse, really.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so kind of weirdly transgressive, that it's in this kind of very innocent problem page, and that when they were initially being published, it was in between somebody writing in about what shampoo was the best to use and how to cook a salmon.
When I used to volunteer for a telephone helpline, we used to get a lot of calls from transvestites, many of whom were genuinely worried about their compulsion. But a few just telephoned in to tell the telephone operator what they were wearing, how sharp their heels were, how big their hair was. And I think that's not unlike the English Woman's Domestic Magazine. I think a lot of those people that wrote in did so not only for the anonymity, but also for the audience.
Aside from the occasional interloper, agony aunts have long been the last resort of young women with very genuine questions that nobody else could answer. In comparison to the tight-lace Victorians, the flappers of the new century looked like thoroughly modern misses. But when it came to the birds and the bees, they were just as clueless as their predecessors.
Dear Mrs. Marriott, I'm getting married shortly and have asked my mother to tell me the intimate facts of life. She says I am thoroughly nasty and morbid and she'll find out soon enough. Can you help?
At one time, agony aunts really were the keepers of secret knowledge. They were the source of answers to a whole list of unmentionable problems. But far from breaking taboos, agony aunts kept their secrets, because the replies to this sort of question were kept private. They were only given via the stamped addressed envelope. Ignorant Betty was one of the lucky ones. She will have got her answer, but the other readers, they will have been left in the dark.
In the 19th century, agony aunts had become the trusted confidants of the middle classes, but in the new century they gained true mass-market appeal. Newspapers looking to increase their circulation introduced problem pages to attract more female readers. The Daily Mirror was the first national paper to do so in 1935, and others soon followed suit. The Mirror's agony aunt was the American Dorothy Dix, whose column was syndicated internationally in 300 newspapers and boasted a readership of 60 million. Until now, agony aunts had been largely anonymous, but Dix was a new type of aunt and a major personality in her own right. And although newspaper advice columns were aimed at female readers, they were to prove just as popular with men. In the 2 decades after the end of the First World War, universal suffrage and improving job prospects brought women new opportunities and new expectations of a life that offered more than marriage and motherhood. But the problem pages of the period reveal that a generation of young men were left bemused and bewildered by this new mood of female independence. The discovery of an agony aunt's reply to just such a letter from 16-year-old Len Tebbett sparked his daughter's interest in the advice columns of the interwar years.
It's a little bit fragile.
Oh, goodness. And what is the advice?
Fairly practical, actually. He'd clearly been writing to a girl that he'd got a bit of a crush on, and she'd not been writing back to him for several months. And her advice was that he was unlikely to get any satisfaction by just continuing writing to her. So it was fairly, down to earth. I think, there's not much chance of this going anywhere further, really.
I think he must have taken the advice, because here you are. So he must have gone on to pastures new and got better luck next time.
That was quite a long time later, I think, because he would have been about 16, I think, which is an interesting period of transition when boys are beginning to get more interested in girls.
I kind of thought that agony columns were a sort of female domain. I didn't realise that men used them so much.
I think in those sorts of boys' cultures there was a great fear of having your leg pulled, talking about personal matters. It was kind of opening yourself up in ways that would make you look weak. So writing to somebody who was very distant, could offer an anonymous form of advice, could be very attractive. They speak a lot of kind of being shy, being unconfident, not being able to understand why women or girls weren't necessarily interested in them, how to make a first move, how to sort of break off a relationship, all those sorts of things. This is from the Manchester Evening News. The column was called The Voice of Experience, and this is called No Appreciation from Her. For 2 years, I have been friendly with a girl who is always telling me of the wonderful times she had before she met me. I am not in a position to give her much, and when I ask her if she is happy with me, she puts me off with a flippant, "Oh, I'm all right." And sometimes she says it so curtly that it hurts my feelings. I do my best to give her an enjoyable time, but what a difference a little appreciation would make. Can you advise me how to make her realise this? Baffled, Levenshume.
Oh dear. I expect he was attracted to her hard-to-get manner, and now it's wearing very thin.
It's quite interesting. There are a number of letters are often described, signed baffled or fed up. I think part of it is to do with this frustration that girls are not sharing the same desire to settle down. These young women are working, there's dancing, the cinema has expanded, and there's a new idea of dating rather than courtship. The idea that you can go out with several young men and you don't have to settle down with the first one that you meet. And I think some of these letters are expressing some of that frustration.
What was the advice that the agony aunts gave to these young people?
I think they're often quite frustrated when young men write in and express their sort of difficulty in establishing a relationship, or the fact that they're rather shy and they find it difficult to make the first movement towards a girl. You know, they get a bit annoyed with them. You know, they're not being sufficiently manly, masculine. They are always encouraged to be more assertive, whereas the girls tend to be told to tone it down.
But there would be no return to the old certainties of a world where men were men and women were demure and deferential. Instead, the outbreak of war in 1939 left agony aunts and their readers facing a host of very modern dilemmas. Dear Mrs. Isles, I married the best husband in the world, but whilst he was away in the army, I had an affair and fell pregnant. My husband assumes the child is his. Should I tell him the truth?
A modern agony aunt might tell a woman who'd had an affair and got pregnant because of it that it would be best to come clean. But that assumption that honesty is integral to a good relationship is a very modern one. In the 1940s, the advice would have been, stay stum and sweep it all under the carpet.
After the war, sales of women's magazines boomed. On their pages, an elite band of advice columnists reigned supreme, confident in their ability to right the country's emotional wrongs.
In 1945, just after the war, Woman's Own appointed a new agony aunt, Mary Grant, and she wrote a very rousing mission statement. It's actually difficult not to sound a bit like Churchill when I'm reading this, but here we go. In the last 6 years, we have seen what lack of understanding, greed and blind selfishness can do to humanity. Lack of understanding of ourselves and our emotional problems can have a more far-reaching effect than many of us dream. Like a stone thrown into a pond when the circles grow wider and wider. If only we can set our problems right before the circles ripple disturbingly out of reach. This reads like a rallying cry for the nation's agony aunts. Germany may have been defeated, but there's still the battle of the emotions to be fought and won on the home front.
Mary Grant may have advocated a new era of emotional openness, but she left her readers in no doubt that their place remained very firmly in the home. Catherine Whitehorn was one of Grant's fellow journalists at Woman's Own and witnessed at first hand the good old-fashioned family values promoted on her page.
There were certain things, that they had to be sort of extraordinarily pretty about. Here's the thing. There was a marvellous one that always came at the back, where you got the answer, but you didn't get the question. The one that I particularly remember was, the answer was, what you describe is not unusual, and very few people would call it wrong. So you go there, well, what was it anyway? Masturbation. But you couldn't mention it on that kind of paper. It wasn't okay.
So let's have a look at one of these. I can't trust my husband. My husband and I have always been happy and have one little girl. For the past few months, I have employed a babysitter. Last week, we went out separately, and when I got in, he had already arrived home. After the babysitter had left, I saw that my husband had lipstick on his face. He admitted that he'd had a few drinks and had kissed the girl. He says it was only silliness and apologised, but I feel I can't trust him again. Oh. This is the reply. I realise how upsetting an incident like this can be, but I think you are exaggerating its importance. Your husband is right in saying it was only silliness.
Put the incident right out of your mind. It certainly is not worth making yourself unhappy about.
Yeah.
She's told by the paper, don't make a fuss about it. Is that typical?
It was assumed that what women really wanted to do was to be happily married, and the best way to go on being that would be on some occasions, not to make an enormous fuss about something that they could get over. And therefore, you didn't want to say, kick him in the balls and go away and get a proper job. This was not what woman's about. Even if he has been having it off with his secretary, which he probably has, then you don't want it to ruin your marriage.
So there's a sort of double standard in Woman's Home at this time. Like, men were allowed to behave in one way, women were supposed to behave in another, and the magazine
they were
just...
supposed to cope with it, yeah.